Sorry, I will start by introducing you. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming, especially Professor Anna Marmodoro. Today I have the pleasure to introduce you to a big reference in ancient philosophical studies. Professor Anna Marmodoro is a professor at St. Louis University, but also an honorary professor at Durham University. She is the author of many known books, such as Everything in Everything, Anaxagoras Metaphysics, Forms and Structure in Plato's Metaphysics, and Aristotle on Perceiving Objects. And soon there will be another volume by Professor Anna Marmodoro on the concept of matter, the history of the concept of matter. So this is like part of that work that will be coming out really soon. We are really happy to have you here today, and we are very much looking forward to listening to your presentation. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Philippa, for this generous introduction. Thank you, everyone, for being here, for having me here. It's really splendid to visit. It's an enormous community in ancient medieval philosophy here, so I'm very delighted to be here. I would say, I'm sorry if I turn my back towards you. Are you okay there? Yes. So, yes, as Philippa mentions, this issue of matter in the history of philosophy has interested me for a long time. And I've come to the position where I want to argue for something quite iconoclastic, namely that there is no matter in Plato's and Aristotle's metaphysics. So the way I actually put it in this talk is there matter in Plato's and Aristotle's metaphysics? And the project is ambitious and complex, so there are two parts to this particular paper. The first part is about Plato, with special reference to Plato's Timaeus, which I consider is the latest dialogue. And as you know, as an expert audience, Plato there introduces a sui generis type of entity, a creatus genus, a third kind of thing that we have not seen before in his previous dialogues. This thing is the so-called receptacle, and many have read the fact that Plato introduced the receptacle in the Timaeus as an indication that's kind of anticipating Aristotle and this conception of matter. And there are some bits and pieces in the dialogue that seem to suggest that Plato anticipates Aristotle's conception of matter. In particular, scholars have focused on the fact that the receptacle is described as propertyless. And so on this basis, they think, well, here it is, Aristotle's prima anticipated by Plato, and historically, we know that at that, Plato had been cohabiting with Aristotle already for a while, so it's not historically implausible to think that there would have been some influence where Aristotle thinks of matter. Well, Plato is thinking of matter too. In the first part of the paper, I argue against this. So I say, and here I'm just summarizing, and we can look at it and discuss the text in discussion time. I basically argue that it is true that Plato in the Timaeus turns his attention towards sensible objects, or material objects like yourselves, the table, the chair, the cat and the tree. So it is certainly a new, fresh start for Plato with respect to the ontology of material objects, but it's not a place where Plato introduces anything like matter that gets informed by forms, namely properties, to constitute material objects. So I argue, and this is, I think, very different from the traditional scholarship on the Timaeus, that Plato introduces the receptacle to do actually two things that have not done before in his dialogues. So the first, I hope is going to sound surprising and possibly intriguing to you. And by means of introducing the receptacle, Plato begins to explore the distinction between something being essentially F and something being non-essentially F. And so the receptacle is a type of entity that is essentially what it is. It has a nature, it is essentially what it is, but it's also non-essentially what the copies of the forms in it make it appear to be. And this is something that I derived from the text from the systematic occurrence of the word finite appearing whenever Plato talks about the presence of the copies of the forms in the receptacle. So, as I say, it's the receptacle serves Plato to draw attention to the fact that they're not considered before, that things may be essentially in a certain way and non-essentially in a certain way. The receptacle is essentially propertyless, but non-essentially appearing to be fiery, watery, etc., etc. So that's the first thing that Plato does with the receptacle, with the introduction of the receptacle. And you can see some text on my handout. I'm not going into the details for reasons of time, but I'm very, very happy to discuss later. The second thing that Plato does by introducing the receptacle is endorsing or putting forward for the first time the thesis that to be a material object is to be somewhere in space. And so this is quite explicit, I think, in the text, where Plato says that something that is not somewhere does not exist at all. So Plato is now associating the what it is to be a material object to be something that is somewhere. And I think the receptacle, understood as space, is giving spatial location, more precisely, to material objects. So the receptacle as the second function to account for what it is to be a material object, in the sense that material objects are occurrent in nature, they're somewhere, as opposed to Platonic forms, the properties that are in a transcendent world. So this is like the interpretation that I give in the of the receptacle in the Timaeus, and that's what leads me to say that Plato does not anticipate in any way any Aristotelian conception of matter. So for those who think that in the Timaeus we find some form of hylomorphism until literum, I think this is not the case. Ask me more if you wish in discussion. I'm very happy to come back to it. But here I just summarize for reasons of time. And now I want to move to our beloved Aristotle. Okay? Aristotle, certainly everybody knows that Aristotle thinks of material objects in terms of hylomorphic composites, meaning that material objects are, and here I use the scare quotes, compounds of, sorry, you're behind, of matter and form. Traditionally, this position, namely Aristotle's hylomorphism, has been understood as if Plato thinks of material objects as if having a sort of duality in the constitution, whereby there are two types of entity involved in the constitution of material object, matter and form. And then the big issue is how is it that they are united? And as you know, you probably know, both in your capacity of scholars of ancient philosophy and contemporary metaphysicians, there is an endless amount of literature on how, on the unity, on the issue of the unity of material objects for Aristotle. So how is it that matter and form make up a thing that is one? So I want to argue against this traditional understanding of Aristotle's hylomorphism. And that's I'm going to say something that I think is quite different from what the literature says, and hopefully intriguing to you. So I want to say that although it is fair to note that there are various texts where Aristotle seems to introduce something that is matter, this text can be given a different interpretation, and if read differently, we understand Aristotle in a more philosophically sound way. So by the charity principle, we should make the most of what these ancient texts tell us and extract from them the best philosophical theory we can. So I think Aristotle does not posit a thing in his ontology that amounts to matter that composes with forms and properties to make up material objects. When people think that Aristotle does posit matter, people use two types of arguments. So textual arguments, like texts, where we find the prima facie mentions of matter, but they also use philosophical arguments. And philosophical arguments are of interest to all of us here. Philosophical arguments where people say, well, look, unless Aristotle posits something that is matter, then it not deal with certain metaphysical issues in his system. So what I do, my strategy is like twofold. I say, look, the texts are as they are, but there are no philosophical reasons to commit Aristotle to positing something that is matter. And so we shouldn't, because if we do, we just generate lots of problems for Aristotle. So two strategies that lead me to the negative conclusion that there is no matter as a thing in Aristotle's ontology. And then one final thing that I want to share with you. So what are material objects for Aristotle? And so that's, I hope it's going to be the most interesting forward-looking part of this talk. So to recapitulate, this audience who certainly knows this stuff, but I mean, why does Aristotle think, why do people think that Aristotle needs matter in his ontology? So we could do that seminar style, and you can give me the reasons why you think Aristotle wants to posit matter in his system, but because time is brief, I'll just tell you what I think the common reasons are. So scholars think that Aristotle needs to posit something that is matter in his system to secure that when there is a change of properties that material objects undergo, there is something that remains. And if something remains, then change is kosher in Aristotle's system, namely there is never passage from being to not being, or vice versa, according to the Parmenidean principles that most, I think, if not all ancient philosophers endorse. So the first reason why matter, the first reason scholars think Aristotle needs matter is to secure continuity in changing properties, both when there are accidental properties that change, so from being paid to being sometime, or substantial forms that change. And by substantial forms, I mean essences in contemporary paradox, like being a human being. So what are the cases of substantial change? Well, think of it like a block of marble that becomes a statue. So as a block of marble, it is essentially a block of marble. As a statue, it is essentially a statue. There has been a change of substantial form there. Or a caterpillar that becomes a butterfly, for example, in nature. So you see the connections here with my study of essentialism and being essentially and non-essentially F. So that's one thing. Second reason why scholars think Aristotle posits or needs to posit matter as an entity in his system is that scholars think that Aristotle needs matter as, I use the metaphor of the pincushion. You know what a pincushion is? Nobody does tailoring anymore, not even my grandmother. Pincushion is that thing where you just put pins on. So the idea is that matter is a thing that on which properties kind of hang on to. So it's like well, in modern parlor we could say it's like a bearer of properties. So matter is needed to be what like properties attach themselves onto. That's a very familiar way of thinking, and so Aristotle needs matter for that reason. So I consider that line of argument too. And then the third, again, very common argument for attributing matter as a thing to Aristotle is that, well, consider, look up, one of the few people whose name I know here, Luke and me, are both essentially human beings, but we're two different particular human beings. So what's it that differentiates us, that makes us numerically two particular human beings? Matter. So like his essential form as a human being is like instantiated in that lump of flesh and bones. Mine is instantiated in this lump of flesh and bones. So matter is needed by Aristotle to be able to differentiate particulars that are of the same type. So two particular human beings who can be Socrates and Antiquity and so on and so forth. So these are three very powerful arguments that scholars use to say that Aristotle is committed to positing matter as a thing in the system. They marry well, they match well the text, and so the conclusion is that we think that Aristotle is a hylomorphist, understood as, and here I want to be very clear, understood as someone who posits this duality in the constitution of material entities, such that the material entity is matter somehow plus or combined with form. So my tall order, my goal here is to consider these arguments with you and the relevant text, and try to show you that Aristotle does not need matter for these physical tasks. So the tasks are there. Aristotle wants all the things I mentioned, but he can do them without positive matter and safety. So, and then, as I say, in the positive part of the paper, I will tell you what I think a material object is, rather than a compound of two things, matter and form. So I begin now by examining the texts and arguments that have to do with Aristotle's need, in scale quotes, of positive matter as what secures continuity through change. I'm sure you heard that before, but you know, I mean, this is how we teach, you know, basically Aristotle's metaphysics at the beginning. And it's a well-grounded reading of texts like T9. So now finally I come to my handout. T9 is at the middle of page 2. Is where Aristotle says, and here I quote, "For my definition of matter is just this, the primary substratum of each thing from which it comes to be and which persists in the result, not accidentally." End of quote. This is a quotation from the Physics. So certainly Aristotle does believe that there is no passage from being to not being, and vice versa. Certainly Aristotle believes that a statue comes to be from a lump of marble and a butterfly from a caterpillar. But I don't think Aristotle believes that there is something that was in the lump of marble that remains as such in the statue. In fact, I think there are reasons why Aristotle could not possibly believe that, and I'm going to try to do the magic of convincing you of why. So, if Aristotle believed that the continuity between a lump of marble and the statue was dependent on the literal presence of something first in the lump of marble and later in the statue, Aristotle would contravene one of the fundamental principles of his metaphysics. What's a principle? The principle is what we call the homonymy principle. I'm sure it rings a bell. Yes, you heard it before. Yeah. Okay. So this principle is explained by Aristotle in the Metaphysics by means of an example. Aristotle says, if I sever a hand from my body, the hand would be a hand only by name. So it will be homonymous, it will have the same name as a functional part of my body and as a known part of my body, but it will be only the name in common. It will not be the same thing. A hand severed by my body is just a piece of flesh, essentially. So it's not the same thing that it was when it was integrated functionally in my body. So that's how Aristotle talks about the homonymy principle. So now generalize the principle. The principle, as if generalized, means that something that is integrated in a functional whole it has a different criterion of identity from something that is not integrated in a functional whole. So piece of flesh functionally connected to my body, operating like my hand, has a certain identity that is dependent on the identity of the substance. So this is my hand. You cut it from me, so the criterion of identity of that thing there, the piece of flesh, is changed now. You only have a piece of flesh. I know the example is super cruel, you know? But it's Aristotle's example. So what does that mean in terms of matter? Just I'll let you think for a few seconds about it. So can there be literally something that is in the lump of marble that is functionally part of it, integral to it, then it's like taken into a different substance, but yet remains the same thing? Well, my argument is that it cannot be the case, because the matter, like the marble in a lump of marble, is identified by the substantial form of the lump of marble, and that matter in the statue is going to be identified by the substantial form of the statue. So when there is a change of substantial form, it's not the same thing. That's what we learn from the homonymy principle. So that's my argument for saying that we cannot believe that there is some matter, literally, that remains the same when there is a substantial change that leads from one substance to another. And if you think about it, again, it's a slightly, kind of, it's not the most friendly of examples that one can give, but think about the generation of an offspring. So, the flesh and bones of a baby are very substantially different from the fluids that, according to Aristotle, make up the baby, right? So I think if you reflect on this, it's very actually intuitive to think of things differently, namely that there is not one thing that is transmitted or passed on from one substance to the other. So I hope you see the force of this argument, but let me just tell you how I replace then the idea that physical continuity, that that two things can transform one into the other without passage from being to not being. So I think Aristotle does not think that is literally the same thing that goes in and out, different substances, but Aristotle still does not want that there is passage from being into not being and vice versa. So what is it that secures this continuity, if not matter? What I want to put forward is that it's actually simply the physical continuity of the process. So as long as there is an uninterrupted process from the existence of a lump of marble to the creation out of the lump of marble of a statue, as long as there is physical continuity. So there is no moment where it's like it bleeds, there is not, I cannot go out of time and then come out on time. As long as there is physical continuity, that's all Aristotle needs to explain that there can be passage from one substance to another. And if you look carefully at the text, that's all we need to account for the fact that a new substance comes to be from a preceding substance. Yes, but not by sharing literally matter, but rather by the uninterrupted process of transformations from one thing to the other. So in the case of the statue, we can think of like the operation of the sculpture acting upon the lump of marble. In the case of natural processes, even more intuitive to think about that. So we go from the caterpillar to the butterfly. There are a million stages in this transformation. So as long as there is no interaction of the process, I think there is continuity, and I think we respect what Aristotle says. So, two reasons why I think you might want to be motivated to buy into my argument here is that one, we kind of the problem of how there is a thing that combines with another type of thing, maybe matter combines with forms. Two, we still respect what the text literally say, and we have a simpler theory with no duality of types of entity in the constitution of a material object. So that's standard argument number one. Standard argument number two. So everybody is, most of us, and I did too, obviously, I'm inclined to think that Aristotle needs matter because he thinks of his properties as non-independent entities, so entities that need to kind of hang on something else for existing. So Aristotle is very different from Plato. For Plato, forms can exist whether they're instantiated or not. For Aristotle, this is not the case. Should there be, I don't know, a catastrophe whereby there are no cats, there would be no property of being a cat anymore. So for him, properties exist as long as they are instantiated. That's a technical term, namely they are attached on, to speak more metaphorically, to something that serves as their bearer. So remember the pincushion image. So properties are like attached to this cushion that holds them. And that's a typical way of thinking about Aristotle's way of thinking of Aristotle that finds ground in a text that is, again, in his audience, I'm sure well known. It's in the Metaphysics, is in particular book 7, chapter 3. So that's a famous chapter in the Metaphysics. If you don't know it, I'm very happy to tell you a bit more about it. So I think it's brilliant. It's a thought experiment. So do you know how it goes? Aristotle says, take a material substance. So I invite all of you to think about any type of material. Better not think about human beings, but think about any type of material substance. And try now the thought experiment of taking away all the properties that material thing has. So think of the table, and you can begin with color. and see how far can you take that thought experiment. So taking away properties, I understand as like abstracting away. So like in your mind, you just try to abstract all the properties that the material entity is. How far can you go in your minds? It's really difficult, okay? Can you really think this table without its color? Maybe. Can you think of this table without material dimensions? Can you think of it without like having its size, the breadth, the width, and so on that it has? Well, Aristotle pushes this and says we can abstract away all properties from a material thing, and at the end of the thought experiment, we find, and I use my words very carefully now, something, okay, scare words, that in itself has no positive characterization nor negative characterization. Now, that thing is that of which everything else is predicated, to use Aristotle's language. So Aristotle says, we have here P11. Aristotle says, well, take these material objects, strip away from this thing all its properties. What remains is something at the bottom, of which all properties belong, and Aristotle's language, of which all properties are predicated. And this text is super interesting because I wanted to just look at it in P11. So Aristotle says it's just a snippet. So the other predicates are predicated of the substantial form, while the substantial form is predicated of, and then use the word matter, okay? Greek is ule. So it seems as if that there are, say, the color of this table, which is predicated of the substantial form of this table, and then the accidental properties of the table plus the substantial form of this table are all predicated of this thing at the bottom, which is matter. Is that possible, right? I ask you to think about it. Is it like, does this make sense within the context of Aristotle's metaphysics? It's very difficult to conceptualize what that would be, because we have been asked to imagine something that even in modern philosophy, it's very hard to imagine, something that in itself is propertyless. So if it is propertyless, there is nothing that you can think of, but that thing serves as what holds all properties, substantial, non-substantial, in the case of a substance. And this has been interpreted as Aristotle believing in the so-called prima matter, Aristotle believing that there is a potentiality at the bottom that can become anything, and so on and so forth. And I think all these interpretations are philosophically very difficult. And and Aristotle would contradict himself if he meant what he wrote here. Why? Because matter now would be that of which everything is predicated, but it itself is not predicated of anything. But we know that that's exactly how he defines substance. So substance is what is not predicated of anything, but everything is predicated with. So you see the tension that we get in the text? So it's a similar move that I'm making here as in the case of the homonymy principle. So we basically commit Aristotle to a very deep and I think very problematic tension between what he says in different bits of his work, very principles which is very deeply committed. So his definition of substance and then his definition of matter do not make sense if we take them together. If we literally think that he posits a thing that is matter, that is propertyless, and it is that which all properties are predicated, then we get matter, this propertyless thing, to be substance. But we know that substance for Aristotle are things like prima, the computer, the table, and so on and so forth. So that's why he cautioned now in not wanting to read Aristotle this way. Because why should we? Why should we think of Aristotle committing himself to a contradiction like that? Of course, there are moves that have been made in the literature. So people say, well, this particular chapter is very problematic. Maybe people even try inventions and things like that. But I think, why should we? Why should we not try, actually, as philosophers, try to recover a better reading of the text that gives us more coherent theory from what we get, and then build on that theory. So I am going to just call your attention in a sort of totally dialogical way. So you don't need to read all the text, but like look at T12. Is the criterion of substancehood, which conflicts with the definition we get to matter. So basically T11 and T12 are in conflict with each other. So I'll just let you look at them. And the force of T12 is that we find the same principle repeated by Aristotle, both in the metaphysics and in the categories. So for those who say, well, look, let's just ignore this chapter of the metaphysics, I say, well, look, the categories are a very established text. Nobody contests that Aristotle believes what writes in the categories. So, we should be really careful about how we handle it. So T11 clashes with T12 and T13. And that's why I think we shouldn't go this route of refining matter on Aristotle's behalf. But then it's my burden, it's on me to just tell you then what is Aristotle doing there? What Aristotle positively saying if he's not saying what he seems to say there. And here I want to, if we had more time together, I would have a lot more to say. But just I want to share with you the key idea that I have. So Aristotle, I think, here is talking about not the problem of how properties are instantiated, i.e. combined with matter, but rather the problem of what it is for something to be, in our terms, actual. By this I mean in the actual world as opposed to any possible or non-existent world. So Socrates, this table, this jug of water are occurrent entities in this world. I can causally interact with it, like I can move it, for example, right? But how, think yourself, engage your own intellect with that. How can we, what can we say, what principles can we use to account for the fact that something is part of the actual world instead of any possible world? And that's a very difficult philosophical problem. Ricardo and other contemporary philosophers in this room, Luca and so on, I don't know exactly what they will do, but know that this is a problem that philosophers think about today as well. It's very difficult to give an answer. One way to think about this problem today is to say, well, the actual world is one where I am. So things are actual in my same world, they're actual with me, as it were. Aristotle, and you can judge if you think that the contemporary versions of the actuality problem, the being the actual world, are to your judgment good solutions. But I can share with you what I think Aristotle thinks about it. I think he thinks that things are actual, so properties are occurrent in the actual world when they are clustered, let's say, together to make up an entity, such as Socrates. I can elaborate on that. That's very difficult, a complex thing to say. But for Aristotle, properties are occurrent in the actual world when they are combined in certain ways, so in such a way that they make up a thing, a substance, such as Socrates. So that's the sense in which properties, as Aristotle says, certainly are dependent entities, meaning they don't float free. They're not like tropes. They don't float free like tropes, okay? They don't float free like platonic forms. Rather, they are dependent entities, but dependent on what? Other properties with which they bundle up, they combine, okay? So, for example, being paid, for Aristotle, is neither a platonic form, a transcendent universal, nor what we would call a trope. It's rather a property that exists only in certain combinations. For example, combined with being a human being. And that makes sense even with language. You wouldn't think that the table is paid, right? So I think Aristotle here is thinking of the problem in Zeta 3 when he talks about matter as the ultimate bearer over properties. He's trying to actually explain how is it the properties that make up substances are occurrent in the actual world. And he's trying to say they are occurrent in the actual world when they are combined in certain ways, so when they make up certain types of substances. So you remember that Aristotle is committed to the alternative species, and kinds of species are real things. So like being a human being, being a table, and so on are like real in existence. So there cannot be gerrymandered objects like a pale piece of plastic, for example. So once you have that in the system, you understand that green properties can be actually, when they combine in the right way in certain bundles that correspond to the kinds of things there are, or the species of living things there are. So now coming back to our text, I think when Aristotle is describing something that does not have any positive characterization, but also no negative characterization, and that is that to which all properties are predicated, is trying to give us this marker, I call it marker of actuality. It's trying to explain what's the difference between Socrates in the possible world and Socrates in the actual world. And the difference cannot be an extra property or an extra entity with which the properties are combined. And that's why Aristotle is saying whatever it is does not have a positive or negative characterization. Namely, it's not an entity, it's a principle. It's like marking off actuality. So I'll let you just reflect a little bit on this. I will not add more myself, but I want to say, if you recognize the problem as philosophers, the problem is, what's the difference between Socrates in the actual world and Socrates in a possible world? How would you account for that difference? Well, Aristotle says whatever the difference is not an extra property, or it's nothing that the properties that make up Socrates combine with. It's rather like being in the world combined in certain ways according to the principles that a species or a kind give. Okay, the identification principle that follows from being of a kind or being of a certain species. So that's my proposal for the second reason, my proposal for addressing the second line of argument that scholars use to commit Aristotle to matter. So again, same structure as the first time. So I look at the text, and I think the text says certain things, but the text would commit Aristotle to contradiction if we took them literally. So I think we shouldn't commit Aristotle to contradiction, and I offer an alternative reading that I think gives us in a sense, simpler reading of Aristotle and also philosophically richer reading of Aristotle. And I'm invited to think in this particular case, we find Aristotle's solution to being actual as opposed to being a possible world interesting, sound, and so on and so forth. Here I just want to put it on the table. And that's that. I want to use a little bit more time now to talk about the third argument that scholars use to argue that Aristotle is committed to a thing that's called matter. I think it's the most intuitive, possible argument of all. So I just want to expand the examples. Look at I essentially human beings. We are all essentially human beings, right? So we are essentially the same insofar as we're human beings. But we are numerically many. I don't know how many we are in this room, but we are many particulars. So traditionally, scholars say, well, Aristotle needs to posit matter as that thing that differentiates as particulars. Look at myself. So same essence, but combined with, and here I want to use the words, something primitively particular, namely matter, that particularizes our essences in such a way that we're essentially the same but different particulars. Now, note the move here, right? So now the particularity that differentiates Luca and me is derived from matter, but matter is assumed to be primitively particular, right? So there's nothing that makes matter particular, rather matter is particular and makes us two particular human beings. So you see the cost, philosophically speaking, of this move. It's like commit Aristotle to an extra linear ontology that's primitively particular, and by being primitively particular, bestows particularity. That's another thing I want to highlight. So why should I derive particularity just by being combined with something that is particular? Is it contagious to be particular? Because matter is particular, primitively particular. I combine with matter, I get particularity out of it. You see what I'm saying? Now I kind of make it lighthearted, but I think there's something deeply problematic in thinking that matter is primitively particular, and by being primitively particular, when attached to form, makes the form particular, right? So I think that again, we give Aristotle a problem that it doesn't have. But clearly there are texts that can be read that way. So I give you an example in my T15. Aristotle says there, and when we have the whole such and such a form in this flesh and in these bones, this is Timaeus or Socrates, and they are different in virtue of the matter, for that is different, but the same in form. Therefore is indivisible. Okay, and that's a quotation from the Metaphysics. So I'm not denying that the text says what it says. I'm just saying if we take it literally, like scholars do, as if that was Aristotle's solution to the problem of the particularization of essences, I think that would be problematic for Aristotle. So what are the alternatives? Well, as I say, I don't think there is matter. Should we rather think then that essences are themselves primitively particular? So Philippa has a particular essences, I have mine, you have yours. But again, I don't expand on this topic here, but I think that too is problematic. It's like multiplying types of entities in the system, so adding these particular essences. Why should they be particular? Of course, in the medieval tradition, this has been explored, but I think that why should we? We don't have evidence that Aristotle thinks that way, at least in the text that I showed you here, form or in the sense of essence is certainly not particular. It's what is actually common. It's the same between Socrates and Socrates, Alias, and all of us. So I now make my positive move, and I think this may be perhaps the kind of the good time to not only wrap up the arguments that I want to give you, but also sketch a little bit my positive proposal. So I read Aristotle's text I make this assumption from the beginning to the end as like in a process of development of certain ideas. So I don't believe that there was first the Aristotle of the categories, the logical works, and then suddenly Aristotle discovers matter, and then the physics and biological works, and then we have like the two systems that, for example, that Dan Grant talks about. So for me, Aristotle is a coherent thinker that has the same ideas from the beginning until the end, only that these ideas get refined progressively. So one important reason why I think that is that if you look at the categories, the very beginning, he's already giving us material objects as examples of substances. So like, did you not notice that substances are concrete, But of course he did. So I think that it's the same. He always thought of substances in the same way, but he went deeper and deeper in the theory. So that's my assumption. So on that assumption, I argue that we have a full analysis of the ontology of material substances already in the categories. But in the categories, there is no matter. So what is a material substance in the categories? Just think yourselves, and I'm sure you get the answer. What do we get in the categories? Well, there are like 10 categories of what? Forms. What are forms? Properties. So we have the substantial form, and then the non-substantial forms in the plural. So there is a category of substance, and then all the other categories, but all there is properties, right? So I want to make the claim, which I define in greater length in other work, that for Aristotle, the ontology of material substance is constituted, it includes only properties. So that's, in contemporary terms, you can translate that, like instead of a type of dual ontology, where there is matter and form that combine to make up the substance, is what's the word? Single category ontology, meaning that at the fundamental level, there are properties only, they combine to make up the material substance. So not two types of entity, one type only, the type being properties. So it's very different to Aristotle that's traditionally presented and understood. But I think in Aristotle that makes a lot of sense. So if substances are constituted only of properties, and I say if, obviously I should give more arguments, we need a lifetime to talk about it, but like if substances are constituted by properties only, what is it that differentiates Luca and me now? What's it that makes us two different particulars, even if we are the same type of thing, because we share the same essence? And the answer is quite natural now at this point, because what differentiates us if we are both simply clusters on, say, combinations of properties, is the fact that there will always be some non-essential properties, maybe accidental properties, that we do not share. For example, our spatiotemporal location. Like, material bodies cannot overlap, they cannot compenetrate. So Luca, it's always going to be somewhere where I'm not, and vice versa, right? So, at least at a very minimal level, material substances are different and particular because in the cluster of properties that make them up, there is always to be some that are not shared. For example, spatiotemporal location. Now, you as philosophers, you may think of potential objections to Aristotle, maybe even counterexamples, such as, and I mentioned, I don't know if you've studied this in your metaphysics courses, the Max Planck's two spheres thought experiment. Do you know about that? So Max Planck suggests that there are these two spheres that are sharing all properties. How is it that they are numerically two? And then it goes through various arguments. I don't know if you're interested, in just trying to show that it's really problematic things that are made out of properties only, but they can be numerically two. Now, why does that problem does not apply to Aristotle? Because Aristotle is an empiricist, by which I mean that he doesn't think of these imaginary cases. For him, substances are the things that are in this world, the things that populate this world. So his concern is about Socrates and Timaeus, not two possible spheres. For him, these possible spheres basically cannot exist as material objects in his world, because his world is populated only by things like us, and things like us are going to be always different with respect to some non-accidental properties. So now I'll give you the really final picture, but as an opening for common discussion. So I think, the proposal that I want to put on the table, the larger project proposal is this. So material entities for Aristotle are constituted by properties only. There is no duality of types, of constituents of the material substance, properties only. But so in this sense, Aristotle is not a hylomorphism in the traditional understanding of the word, where there are two types of things combined together. I try to give you reasons why I think we shouldn't think that Aristotle has matter as an entity in his ontology, the reasons that we discussed so far. So if substances are properties only, there is a sense in which we can still call Aristotle a hylomorphism. We make sense of all he says about matter by translating this idea that there are different types of entity in the constitution of the substance into the different types of properties in the constitution of the substance. So we have the essential ones, to use our terms, like the essential form, and the non-essential ones, the accidental ones. So for every substance that is made out of properties, there will always be some non-essential ones that differentiate that substance from another substance. And having that allows Aristotle to do everything else he wants in his system without committing to this sui generis, very problematic type of thing, the substance. So there is more to be done to round off my project, which I'm not going to aim to here. And what else is there to do, and how do I do it? Well, is to account for the unity of substance if the substance is constituted by properties only. So that's like the next chapter in the story. Another time we'll talk about that. But I want to say that I've not done that here. I've only shown you what I think the fundamentals in Aristotle's ontology of substance are. So now let me just draw a very final conclusion. So the final conclusion is this. When we think of Plato as already kind of anticipating a certain idea of matter as propertyless in the Timaeus, and when we think of Aristotle as positing something that is matter in his system, I think we can project upon these thinkers and their texts problems that are not their own. So my claim as consequences for how we read both the Timaeus and Aristotle and his works. So I think that there is discontinuity between the Timaeus and Metaphysics of the Timaeus and Aristotle's Metaphysics. discontinuity in the sense that the receptacle is not an anticipation of any kind of matter in Aristotle. What Plato does by introducing the receptacle is very different from what Aristotle does. So the receptacle serves Plato to do something else, differentiating essential and non-essential, and locating things in space. But these two things actually also give us some continuity with Aristotle, only that in another dimension, because they give us a picture of Plato's late ontology, the Timaeus of sensible things, as going in the same direction of Aristotle. So what are material objects from Plato's perspective in the Timaeus? Well, they are copies of the forms that happen to be in space. So that is the spot, that's where we should look at if we want to see a continuity between Aristotle and Plato, and not this idea that there is a propertyless substratum, which Plato kind of anticipated and then Aristotle developed in his ontology. So it's a big project for these two ancient thinkers, and as Philippa kindly mentioned, this is a project I'm studying in a diachronic sense too, and so I'm not doing the other bit by myself. So I put together this group of scholars that are looking at how matter, what matter actually is in the mostly in Western philosophy, but with some openings to Indian and Chinese philosophy. So the overall hypothesis that the book that that just finished puts forward is that there is literally nothing, which we refer to the term matter, that remains the same diachronically. So every thinker in the history of philosophy posits something that, with the name of matter, that serves certain needs and tasks within the system. But I think, again, it's the bigger assumption that, Plato has matter, Aristotle has matter, the alchemists have matter, blah, 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 contemporary understandings of matter. I think that's a big rationalization that is a little bit misguided, that we have developed when we think at the history of metaphysics. So, as I say, I have a lot to share, and I'm very happy to just go back to the points that you were interested mostly in, or that found problematic, or you want to reject. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Need some time to write your names because I wrote it. So, Pedro.
Okay, so thank you very much. This was really interesting.